Hi everybody, and welcome to another One History Help video with me, Ms. O'Neill. This is the second in a 4-part series that I'm doing on public health for AQA's Britain, the Health and the People 1000 to the present day, also known as medicine or medicine through time. This video, as you can see, is all about public health during the Renaissance era. So by that, we're talking about Tudors and Stuarts. And we are looking at the years from like early 1400s through to the early 1700s. Hopefully you've already seen my video on medieval public health. I know that one was a little bit on the longer side, but hopefully this one will be a little bit snappier because I won't need to go through in so much detail with you guys this time about what we mean by this term public health. Not to contradict myself here, but I am going to start every video off with a shared definition of what we mean by public health. And remember that only a government can put a public health system in place. And they essentially exist to make sure that the population is going to remain healthy. There's lots of things that can be considered as public health, and the list that you can see on the screen here isn't an exhaustive list, but it's some of the major bits. So for example, providing clean water, vaccination programs, and going into the modern era in Britain, we are looking at the idea of providing healthcare through hospitals as well. As I would have shared with you in the medieval video, I've got this little flow diagram here in terms of the things that constitute public health. So in each of the videos that I'm going to be doing, and again, if you've seen the medieval one, you'll know this by now, I'm going to be looking at the hygiene and cleanliness of people in the different time periods we'll be looking at. We will look through the lens of a particular specific disease and relate that into public health. We'll look at the idea of hospitals. Whilst the government itself doesn't provide hospital care until the modern era, I think it's important that we look at hospitals as a through line during these 4 different time periods leading up to essentially what will be the introduction of the National Health Service. Like I said, because public health can only be introduced by a government, we will be looking at what governments are like in these different time periods and therefore the public health laws they put in place. Because, as I mentioned in the medieval video, there is a direct relationship between how strong and involved a government is with its population with the kind of public health laws it puts in place. So as you can see, when we're looking at Renaissance, Tudor and Stuart public health, we're going to be, again, looking at the health and hygiene of these people at this time. We're going to look at the Great Plague as a way to understand more about public health measures at this time. We're going to look at the impact the Reformation had on hospitals. And if you're uncertain about what I mean by that, then hold tight. I promise you I'll explain it with you later on in the video. And of course, like I mentioned, we'll look at governance and the public health laws that are put in place. Please be aware that whilst I will cover all these things in the video, I won't necessarily be doing it in this order. Let's start off then with hygiene. How dirty and smelly were people in Renaissance Britain, in Tudor and Stuart Britain? Hopefully, like I said, you've seen the medieval video already, but for those of you who haven't, maybe you've jumped straight into here possibly, just be aware that this idea that people in the past were indeed dirty and smelly is a massive misconception. To say that they didn't care about their appearance or how they smelt, for example, just isn't true whatsoever. In the medieval era, in the medieval video, I would have explained to you that the reason people cared so much about what they looked like, how dirty they were, or how smelly they were, is because dirt and smell was associated with sinfulness. So if you were a person with, let's say, bad breath, for example, you would be considered a sinful person. If your house was dirty, then you would be considered to be living a sinful life. Now, whilst religious beliefs do continue into the Renaissance era, granted they are weakened somewhat by the Black Death because of people kind of losing faith to an extent, and if you want more on that, again, it's covered in the medieval public health video as well. So whilst people in the Renaissance are still religious, their attitudes surrounding dirt and smell have changed somewhat. And now people's personal cleanliness is a way of being able to tell if someone was wealthy, cultured, sophisticated, or if they were poor and uneducated. So essentially, it's now being used to demonstrate and work out someone's social class. Now, wealthy people would really go to quite strong and extreme lengths to make themselves clean. They would remove smells from their body and perfume themselves on a daily basis. And they would again go to great lengths to make sure that they kept a clean home as well. With that in mind, it was actually very rare for people, even the wealthy people of our society, to have a bath at this time, to the point where they completely submerged themselves or dunked themselves in water. Now, the reason for this is because they believed that water carried infection. Now, before we get too carried away with this, let's remember that this is still pre-germ theory. So this isn't this idea that people think that there are germs in the water. They are concerned that water is something that could give you illness. Let's also remember, please, that this is the time where people don't even drink water. Having a clean water supply to drink from was almost impossible at this time. And again, that's something I talked a little bit about in the medieval video as well. And it continues into the Renaissance too. Those people who have access to clean water are those people who live out into the remote mountainous countryside where they live next to an open open mountain stream where they can literally cup the water in their hands. But that is a very, 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 very small percentage of the population. And so by and large, people see water as being dirty, and rightfully so. That is very, very true indeed. So people won't bathe in water unless they absolutely have to. And yes, whilst medical risk in their mind was part of that, expense is another part of it too, which I think goes in part to explain why Elizabeth I, I believe, I'm going to get my statistic wrong here, but I'm pretty sure she only had a bath like once a year or once every couple of months or something like that. We still have people washing their hands regularly as well, because we are still looking at a time where people eat with their hands. Even the wealthy who can afford basic cutlery will still prefer to eat with their hands. So washing hands regularly is really important. Again, let's not get too carried away. We're not talking about using bars of soap or anything. Ultimately, we're talking about removing visible dirt from your hands to be able to eat, therefore. There is a certain irony to the Renaissance connection between bad smell and social class, because they believed that somebody who had bad breath would be poor. But the irony in that is that actually the people who were poor in our society would have had much better dental hygiene than the wealthy. And that's nothing to do with toothpaste or toothbrushes or anything like that. They do not exist at this time. You might have had a very, very basic kind of herbal-based ointment maybe that you could rub on your teeth possibly, but that's not what even I'm talking about. The reason why poor people had better dental hygiene than wealthy people was to do with the wider theme of trade and travel at this time. In the Renaissance, Britain, along with many other nations like Spain and Portugal, are discovering the Americas. They are discovering the Caribbean. And when they discover these places, they discover sugar. And sugar is brought back to Britain, and it is not cheap. So poor people cannot afford sugar. And it was seen as a real kind of flex, if you will, a real kind of wealth status thing if you had sugar in your home. Now, I could be getting confused with Regency Britain here, but I'm pretty sure in the later Renaissance era, the later Stuart era in Britain, people used to, like wealthy people used to literally just have bowls of sugar dotted around their houses for people just to like literally dip into as they walked past them. So having sugar was a real sign of your wealth. Elizabeth I, Queen Elizabeth, absolutely loved sugar. You may well have seen this kind of thing on Horrible Histories before, quite possibly. She loved sugar so much that she ate it constantly to the point where her teeth were yellow. And by the time she became old, they went completely black. So yeah, there's a certain irony that people would have thought that bad breath would have meant you were poor, but actually the poor couldn't afford the things that would have given them cavities and poor dental hygiene as such to be able to actually have the bad breath in the first place. So a bit of interesting irony there, in my opinion. Thinking now about the role of governance in Renaissance England, and again, I am saying England as opposed to Britain here because England and Scotland are essentially two separate realms for the vast majority of the Renaissance, and it's only into the later 1700s that Ireland becomes officially involved with the British Isles. So we're going to keep it with England for the moment. In the video on the medieval public health, I divided governance into things that were happening and things that weren't. I'm going to do something slightly different with the governance of Renaissance England because there is a significant turning point that takes place during the Tudor and Stuart era that sees a dramatic change in governance. And that event is the English Civil War, which takes place in the 1640s and into the early 1650s as well. You might remember learning this earlier on in your schooling, quite possibly, about the Roundheads and the Cavaliers, King Charles I against Oliver Cromwell and the Parliamentarians. And this is very significant as an event in terms of the impact on governance in England, because it's the time when the swing moves from us having absolute monarchs who believe in this concept of divine right, that the king is appointed by God, through to this concept of what we call constitutional monarchs. So a monarchy ruling with a parliament. So let's break that down a little bit further. So what's governance like in Renaissance England? Well, before the 1640s, before the English Civil War, monarchs still have absolute power. They still have parliaments who are mainly there to advise and also collect tax. But we are noticing that they are becoming increasingly more important. This is due by and large to the change in our society. So the change in how wealth is being distributed and how people become powerful and influential. Don't get me wrong, you're still talking about a time where a monarch would appoint people to be like sirs and lords and things like that. But nonetheless, we have this kind of emerging, almost like a middle class almost, where people who would have previously been either in that kind of rich or poor category are actually kind of lingering in the middle here. And that's going to be really important moving forward, especially into the industrial era as well. So monarchs still have absolute power. Like I said, they believe in this concept of the divine right of kings, that God has appointed them and therefore their rule can never be questioned. But Parliament is becoming increasingly more important, especially in comparison to the medieval era. Moving on beyond the Civil War, we see, like I said, our monarchs becoming constitutional. It doesn't happen straight away. It's a gradual change that happens following the Civil War, following the execution of Charles I, the Republic under Oliver Cromwell, the restoration of the monarchy under Charles II, and eventually the Glorious Revolution under William and Mary, who are our first, you could argue, official constitutional monarchs. So it is, if it helps you to understand, our monarchs nowadays in England, in Britain, are constitutional monarchs. They are there to rule alongside Parliament. But Parliament ultimately has the ultimate kind of power, if you will, well, where monarchs have the final say, which is the same in our society as well. So by the time we get to the later Renaissance era, Parliament is becoming a lot more powerful, but it's important for us to note, as it says here, that Parliament still only represents the wealthiest members of society. We're not into a kind of full democracy situation whatsoever here. This is going to be really important when we get into looking at industrial public health, because democracy significantly ramps up during that time. But looking at the Renaissance, whilst we have a parliament that's becoming a lot more powerful, that doesn't mean to say that that power is filtering down or coming from the ordinary people themselves. We're now going to move in to look at the Great Plague as a kind of lens to help us understand public health and how public health worked during the Renaissance. Now, it's really important that we are aware that between the Black Death of the mid-1300s and the Great Plague of 1665, there were several outbreaks of plague. And every time a new plague broke out, it was referred to as the Great Plague. Now, the Great Plague of 1665 is, as we will learn, the last major outbreak of plague in this country, which is why it has retained the title of the Great Plague. So what I need us to be aware of, and this is a kind of common misconception that a lot of GCSE students have, is that it wasn't like the Black Death and then the Great Plague of 1665. Plague kept coming back between the mid-1300s and the mid-1600s as well. And the reason why the 1665 plague is known as the Great Plague is because it is the last one of its kind. Now, all of these plagues that take place between the Black Death and the Great Plague are brought to England by ships, all through trade and travel. And during the Renaissance period, the Tudor and Stuart era, the trade and travel that English people are partaking in is significantly greater than it was during the medieval times. And if we think about it, for those of you who maybe study Elizabethan England as part of your GCSE history, you will know that during the Elizabethan era, in the late Stuart era, our naval presence is becoming incredibly significant. So ships coming and going from England is significantly greater in number now in the Renaissance than it was in the medieval era. This is one of the reasons why plague is occurring so frequently. Now, before we even get to the Great Plague of 1665, during the mid-Elizabethan era, so kind of mid to late 1500s, we are seeing around 250,000 people dying of plague in some cities, where that roughly equates to a quarter of the population. Now, there is one particular plague which happens, again, way ahead of this one in 1665. It takes place in 1563. It's a plague that was so severe, the death toll was so incredibly high, that London city authorities started putting together what you can see on the screen right here. This is called a bill of mortality. And what this essentially does, it records the number of people that die and what they die from. And it would be done in individual parishes. Now, the reason it's done by a parish, by a church, is actually quite logical, because if you think about it, they are the ones who are going to be burying the bodies. They are the ones who are going to be conducting the funerals. Also, actually, even in a traditional sense, it was very, very common for religious institutions to be the record keepers, both at this time and beforehand as well. Now, the reason why bills of mortality, like the one you can see on the screen here, are so incredibly important with our country's public health history is because it is the first official time that we are taking in health statistics. Before these bills of mortality, we could only make guesses to what people are dying from, in what quantity, when, and in what areas. So these statistics, even though it looks a very, very basic piece of paper, if you will, are incredibly insightful. If you want to take a pause and have a read through some of the illnesses on here, some of them are quite, I was going to say laughable. That would be really unfair and disrespectful of me to say laughable. But, you know, they're just things that we don't have nowadays. For instance, I think one of my favorite ones is in the middle row, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, fifth one down, which says frighted, which I'm assuming means frightened. So that I always thought that was quite an interesting one there. But yes, the bills of mortality, incredibly important because they mark the official beginning of health statistics. The bill of mortality you can see on the screen now is from the year 1665 in London. in one of the parishes of London, excuse me, not the entirety of London. And we can tell that because we can see on the third column, second one down, the sheer number of people who died from plague in that one area at that time, 68,596, and it is so significant that they actually, down towards the bottom, actually give separate statistics of those people dying from plague. So these are incredibly important, and they continue beyond its first introduction. And as I just said, this one here is from that year 1665. Now, beyond this, the outbreaks of plague which happened during the Elizabethan era, that really significant one of 1563, sees even further public health measures being introduced. The Elizabethan Privy Council made a series of 17 different orders to limit the spread of the plague. They included this idea that every town had a group of magistrates, i.e. people in charge, who would meet every 2 to 3 weeks to review how the disease was progressing. And I don't mean progressing in a positive sense. I mean essentially, how many people is it killing? How quickly does it seem to be spreading? The Privy Council also ordered that the clothing and the bedding of plague victims were to be burnt, and the funerals were to be taken place at night time as well, to limit the spread of infection. Now, any household where an infected person lived, the Privy Council ordered that their house was to be boarded up for at least 6 weeks. So if someone was found in that house to have the plague, their house would be boarded up for 6 weeks with all of their family and all of their servants inside, even if they weren't sick. So let's say, for argument's sake, you had a husband, a wife, and they had 3 children, and only the wife got sick. It didn't matter. They would all be boarded up. And not only that, they would have a watchman stood guard outside of their house to make sure that nobody left. Now, again, to remind you, this is a measure that they put in place in the 1500s, in the 1563 outbreak of plague. By the time we get to 1665, we are going to see that many of these measures continue to stay in place, and we are also going to see that actually the sheer number of people and the frequency at which they are dying and the rate that they are dying at means that some of these measures are going to be almost impossible to fulfill. Let's delve a bit deeper into the Great Plague of 1665 here. I'm hoping you've seen the images on the screen here before. On the right-hand side, you've got a plague doctor, which though you might not have even seen that one specifically, you might have seen something similar. And I do hope you have seen the one on the left-hand side. I love using this picture when I teach about Renaissance medicine in general, but it's brilliant for public health. Feel free to pause the video in a moment and take a look for yourself before I start talking through it. This is really good revision. This is really good work for you to help you bring knowledge to the fore here, everybody. So feel free, pause the video. What elements of public health can you see in this image? What signs can you see? And when I say signs, I don't literally mean signs. I mean things you can see. Give you the impression that there are rules in place for how things should be dealt with during this time. So I'll give you a moment if you want to press pause and have a think about that. And then I'm going to carry on talking about the Great Plague of 1665, referring to these pictures. Now, most diagnoses of plague were made by searchers. And searchers were 2 women in every parish who would visit the house of someone who had died. And they would carry these long white wands, not dissimilar to the one you can see on the plague doctor there, that they would use to examine the corpse to determine why somebody had died. And they would in turn inform the authorities. And it would be that information that would be used to build the bills of mortality. Now, much like in the Elizabethan times, if the searchers in 1665 found an infected person, their house was closed up with all of the occupants inside and the words "Lord have mercy" painted on the door in red, along with a red cross as well. And hopefully you can see that in the image just there. One of the things that I have done with this image in the past with students is how many red crosses can you see in this picture? Feel free if you want to have a pause and count them out yourself, and in a moment I will tell you the answer. The answer is 5. The answer is 5. There are 5 red crosses in this picture right here. Now, this picture I find really interesting because you can see as well the padlock on the door to the door that's nearest to us, which suggests that these people have indeed been boarded up inside. We can see the family there sat on their possessions and crying with their heads in their hands. So this is interesting because this picture here is kind of different to what the historical information suggests. It's like I said, normally the healthy would be boarded up with the sick, but the impression we're getting here from this image is that only the sick person has been left inside and the healthy have been forced to leave instead. Again, much like in the Elizabethan era, if the provision allowed it, you would also have a watchman on place in the door, outside the door, to make sure that nobody went in or came out of this house, with the padlock there on it as well. I find this really, really fascinating, this next bit here. Again, going with this idea that whole families would be boarded up inside these houses. What a lot of very wealthy people did in this situation, and just to be clear, the Great Plague and plagues before it, much like the Black Death, affected rich and poor alike. Wealthy people would get old, poor women to volunteer to be boarded up in the house with the family. So keep in mind that this is happening because somebody in the family has plague and all of the healthy people have to stay inside. These older, poor women would volunteer to be locked up with you. And they would do that to essentially keep the house clean, cook, and essentially look after you. Now, while I say they volunteered, they wouldn't do it for free. And this position would be incredibly well paid. Because let's face it, there was a very, very good chance that you would die going into and being locked up into this house with a plague victim. But if you were able to get out and you survived, then you would have the chance to make a lot of money out of that. And the reason I find that so interesting is because many historians believe that this idea is almost like the beginnings of nursing. This idea of having specific people there to look after you and make sure you were okay. Not to administer medical treatment, but to essentially compassionately care for you. We can also see in the image this idea, much like existed in the Elizabethan times in 1665, we are seeing that bodies are only brought out at night. And one of the things that they did during the Great Plague, and you can see it in the image on the screen here as well, is that you would have a watchman, again, another watch person, who would have a bell that they would ring and would shout out to people to bring out their dead. So they would only be brought out at night. And the bodies would then be placed onto carts. And again, you can see the cart in the image there, where they would then be taken to be buried in a mass grave. Now, again, the idea of using a mass grave rather than individual burial speaks to just how many people were dying of plague. Remember, that bill of mortality had over 68,000 people in 1 year in one place. And that's just from plague. That's not including all of the other things people died of. So the quickest way to be able to bury these bodies, because there was no way they had the time or the space to bury people individually, was essentially to dig a plague pit, as it was called, a massive pit in the ground where the bodies were thrown into. Some of these still very much exist to this day. When some of the new London Underground lines were being built in recent years, like the Elizabeth line, for instance, they actually found them. They also found some from the Black Death eras as well. So they still very much exist under the streets of cities like London. As well as this, you would have had much, again, like we can see in the picture. This is why this picture is so amazing, in my opinion. They burnt fires in the street, and they did that to try and remove the poisonous air. The first time that I show my students this image is when I teach them about the concept of miasma, and this idea of trying to get rid of bad air. The concept that bad air caused plague was incredibly popular at this time. As many of you, as I'm sure you well know, that is why these plague doctors have got these beaked masks on their faces. And those beaks would be stuffed with herbs and spices and things that essentially smell good to get rid of the bad air. All homeowners were also ordered to sweep the streets in front of their house, and no animals were allowed outside where there was known to be plague. Again, this idea that animals are connected to disease existed in the Black Death, and we're seeing it continue into the Great Plague as well. Another common misconception that exists in history is that the Great Fire of London of 1666 ended the plague. That's not true. That's not true. Now, I'm not to say that the Great Fire of London didn't play a role moving forward, and I'm going to talk about that shortly, but we can't say that the fire killed all the rats and therefore the plague stopped. It doesn't quite work like that. But the reason why the Great Fire of London is so significant isn't in the short term, but is in the long term. Now, I'm very confident that lots of you who are watching this now would have learned about the Great Fire of London at primary school, and you would have learned that one of the reasons why the fire spread so quickly, and another reason why the plague spread so quickly, is because all of the houses were so incredibly close together. Houses and other buildings as well. Incredibly close together, and for the purpose of fire, they were all made of wood. Now, because of this, the fire spread incredibly quickly, and essentially London burnt to the ground and needed to be rebuilt again. You may well be aware of the architect Christopher Wren, for example, who was responsible for the rebuilding of St. Paul's Cathedral. Well, St. Paul's is not the only building that's rebuilt, and actually the entirety of London is replanned. And the way that the city was rebuilt in the aftermath of the Great Fire of London stopped the plague from spreading. You remember I said before that 1665 was the last outbreak we had of plague in London especially. That is because of the town planning that took place. It made sure that buildings were made of stone this time and that they were properly distanced apart. Now, again, that doesn't stop plague overnight, but it does definitely have an impact into the short-term future. The only time when that starts to go against itself is when we get into the industrial era and we start to get overcrowding because of population increase, rapid population increase at that, but more on that in the next video. As well as this, you might remember me saying earlier on in the video that one of the main reasons why plague kept on happening was because of trade and travel. And the number of ships going in and out of big cities like London was increasing dramatically during the Renaissance era. So our government responded to that. And when I say government, again, I don't mean the government like we have nowadays. We are talking about 1666. So we are looking at after the English Civil War. We are looking at the time of the rule of Charles II. Charles II is not a constitutional monarch. He is still considered an absolute monarch. But we are talking about a time now where he is very worried that he will end up receiving the same treatment as his father did from Parliament, i.e. being executed. So Charles II, on the whole, is a lot more cooperative with Parliament. On the whole, I mean, that's another story for another day in terms of the complexities of that. But the reason why I mention that is because we are starting to see now certain laws being passed that essentially monarchs would not have really been bothered with before. So in 1666, the government introduces a quarantine law for any ships that arrive in England with disease on board. And by that, I mean with a member of the crew unwell. If that happens, you are not allowed off of your boat until that person is well. And if that time where you are kind of got your ship docked but you are not disembarking is too long, and forgive me now, I can't remember the exact period of time, but you will essentially be told to turn back and go back to where you came from. So that is another reason why we see plague drop off almost entirely after 1665. Let's finish up then by looking at the role of the Reformation on hospitals in this country. Now, before I talk about the Reformation, let's just remind ourselves from the video on medieval public health that hospitals like we recognise them today don't really exist at this time. As I'll go on to talk about shortly, that is beginning to change somewhat in the later Renaissance era, but for the vast majority of it, it's not what you would recognise hospitals to be today. Also, if you need a reminder of what we mean by the Reformation, we are talking about the event that takes place not just in England, but throughout Europe under the leadership, if you will, of Martin Luther, the German monk, who essentially, how can I put this? Martin Luther essentially says that the Catholic Church is greedy, sinful, and corrupt, and that actually countries would be a lot better by having their own Christian faiths in protest of the Catholic Church, as when we have the creation of Protestantism. Henry VIII is the one that is associated with the Reformation in this country. He is the first Protestant monarch of our country. He is the one who creates the Church of England, and I'm sure you remember that he predominantly does so to be able to divorce from Catherine of Aragon and marry Anne Boleyn, but there are other reasons as well to do with money and power too. But the reason why we are mentioning this here is because there is a direct link to one of the actions that Henry VIII orders under the Reformation and the role of hospitals in our country. To be able to seize the wealth of the Catholic Church in England, Henry VIII orders for the dissolution of the monasteries. And by that I mean he has them destroyed and looted. And if you look at the picture here, you can see exactly that going on. Monasteries were incredibly wealthy places, and essentially Henry VIII gets rid of all of the wealth from the monasteries and even goes as far as actually smashing them up as well. Now, the reason why this links to hospitals is because, and again, if you've watched the medieval video, you'll know this already, that the monasteries is where a lot of people who were sick would go to for some form of medical care, not treatment, but for care. And the buildings in the monasteries that handed out that care were called infirmaries. It's places where people would go to be able to rest and have food and like I was going to say water, but no one drinks water at this time, but you get my point. And especially to be prayed for and have certain sacraments like the Eucharist administered to you as well. So when the Reformation happens and Henry VIII destroys the monasteries, it also destroys people's access to what we would kind of refer to as a hospital as such. Now, in the later Renaissance era, so way beyond the time of Henry VIII and into the industrial era, the idea of hospitals as we recognise them, i.e. somewhere that you would go to be treated to get better, began. So the idea that a hospital needed to do more than just care for you, but also to cure you, was beginning in this late Renaissance, early industrial era. With this in mind, there still are not loads of hospitals in this country whatsoever. In the hospitals themselves, you would notice that doctors are now being trained as well as going to university, which to us nowadays is incredibly common. For those of you who maybe know people who've trained to be doctors or might even be considering such a career for yourself as well, you will know that as well as theory-based training, you also need to go through substantial amounts of in-person work as well, in hospitals, in doctors' surgeries, and so on. But the reason why this is so novel at this time is because previously doctors never went to areas like infirmaries, for instance. The monks were the ones who were in charge, and sometimes you might have had nuns there as well to help them run the infirmaries. A doctor would not be seen at all. We also see into the later Renaissance and early industrial era an increase in different types of hospitals specializing in particular illnesses. The main way that we had different hospitals in the medieval era, and I didn't actually mention this in that previous video, but I'm going to mention it now, were hospitals for conditions like leprosy. For example, Lazar houses, as they were known as, Lazar, based on the I was going to say character, but the person Lazarus from the Bible, who had leprosy. But again, into the Reformation and into the Renaissance era, the post-Reformation Renaissance era, we are seeing lots of specialist hospitals occurring. Again, not to the extent that we see nowadays, but certainly in a way that gives the impression that doctors themselves are starting to become a lot more specialist. Now, whilst we are moving away from hospitals, quote unquote, being in monasteries, the religious connection to hospitals hasn't disappeared entirely. A lot of them are named after saints. A lot of the hospitals that still exist in London nowadays, like Guy's and St. Thomas's, for example, are examples of hospitals which are created at this time. And also, it's very, very important that we are aware that none of these hospitals are set up or funded by the government at this time. All of these hospitals are run by charities, and most of these charities, in fact, I would say 99.9% of these charities are religious in nature. And there we have it, Renaissance Public Health. Thank you so much if you've stayed with me for this whole video. I said it was going to be shorter than the other one, and it's ended up being nearly exactly the same length, but that's because I just love talking about this so much. I really hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you find it useful in terms of supplementing what you have learned already about Renaissance Public Health as well. If you have found it useful, feel free to give it an old thumbs up and a bit of a like for us. And if you want to subscribe to the channel, you're more than welcome to as well. And feel free to check me out on Instagram as well. You'll find me there at One History Help. Until next time in the video on industrial public health, take care. Goodbye.